Hi, everyone. I'm Sonali Basak, financial correspondent for Bloomberg News. With me today, I have Ryan Williams, the CEO of real estate investment firm Cadre, and Raymond McGuire, who was the former New York City mayoral candidate and former vice chair of Citigroup. You know him very well. Thank you both for joining us. You know, one place I really want to start is how you two met, because it goes back a long time and it really speaks to mentorship and the importance of a network when it comes to equality and finance and bringing people up. Ryan, you know, how did Ray get involved back when you were at Harvard and starting to try to create more opportunities in financial services for underrepresented groups?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And, you know, Ray and I go back about 15 years. And Ray, for me, has really been an inspiration and somebody who showed me what was possible for people like me, people who came from working class backgrounds, and especially in a place like Harvard. So I met Ray through some outreach I did. I started an organization my freshman year called Veritas Financial Group, really to help level the playing field for minority students looking to get into the financial services world. And there was one clear shining star that I had read about and I had heard about, who was a Harvard man through and through. After outreach and some persistent outreach, Ray agreed to speak to the organization at our first annual conference, and then have a side conversation with me as well about what I could do and what I could be. And that was the start of the relationship. And since then, I've done everything I can to cultivate it, to learn from Ray, to be guided, and then to learn from his example of giving back as well. So we go way back, and I'm grateful for everything he's done, and I think it speaks to the power of mentorship in a space that has been pretty homogenous, like the financial services industry.
Right, and you have obviously, worked at a number of financial firms, Goldman Sachs, Blackstone, and now forming your own firm. Ray, in your long history on Wall Street, has there been a significant change? And especially in the last year, has there been a change that's persistent enough to keep the ball rolling?
It is a great question. I've been in the financial services world for last year marked 36 years. And so while we have made some progress, there's still miles to go before we reach the peak of Everest, if you can allow me to use that. And I've never climbed Everest, but you can imagine. I use that as an analogy to give you a sense of the distance from which we have come and the distance to which we need to continue to ascend. So there's still a lot of work to be done, a lot of work to be done. I'm encouraged by the examples of people like Ryan. There are examples that exist around the country, clearly at our alma mater, which we celebrate, but there are examples that exist around the country, and we need to make certain that we identify them and give them the opportunity.
It's worth speaking about the role of not just the financial community, but also the corporate community at large. Ray, you had been running for mayor of New York City. You got to see this from not only your time at Citigroup, but also as a significant member of this community. Have you seen in productive ways the private sector fill in the blanks, so to speak, in the last year in a way that can create meaningful change?
Well, you described the last year. I think you need to look at the history of the private sector involvement. Private sector needs to do more, to be quite candid with you. If I look across the financial services industry and look at trillions of dollars of assets under management, and look at the representation, the demographic, racial, gender representation in the financial services industry writ large, it still has enormous work to do. And it can't just be the George Floyd moment, about which I'm certain we'll have some discussion. It's got to be a movement. And up to this point, I've not seen the financial services industry step up in any tangible way that it needs to. The private sector has to get involved. Private sector can't sit on the sideline. Acquiescence and complicitness is not acceptable in a world where we're facing two existential crises, climate and wealth gap. And the private sector cannot abdicate its responsibility.
Well, speaking of George Floyd, since the murder of George Floyd, we did see last year just corporations make some commitments, a number of commitments. But since then, Bloomberg has been tracking how much this comes up in conference calls and other outreach by corporations, and the level has really waned since then. Ryan, what do you think needs to be done to keep this at the forefront of profit-making entities, right? I mean, how do we bring society back into the fold in this conversation and equality?
Yeah, well, look, I can speak to my experiences, and I can speak to what we're doing at Cadre. I don't have, a silver bullet by any stretch of the imagination in terms of long-term change catalyst. But what I will say is that action is the first thing, and accountability is critical. People need to, people being institutions, need to take the same level of creativity and tenacity that they take to solving business problems and apply it to the disparities that we see and the lack of representation for people who look like me. And frankly, I'm fortunate and privileged. I know that I'm in many ways one of the few folks who have had institutions back me and the like, and I shouldn't be the exception. There should be more focus. There should be more accountability. Should be more tracking. We should tie things like compensation and other incentives to diversity because it's a competitive advantage. And what we've tried to do at Cadre is just that. We use our platform to diversify the real estate ecosystem, starting with operators, starting with minority depository institutions and Black-owned banks that we're partnering with. And hopefully it's a model that others can emulate. But I think it does start with, number one, people putting resources behind these efforts and holding themselves accountable the same way they hold themselves accountable to business results.
And Ray, maybe you can double down on this idea. You had mentioned that the financial system is not doing enough, right? And that is seen by the numbers, right? But also this moment that had started last year in the wake of George Floyd. I mean, what has it meant? How has the conversation advanced since then? And what do you need to see from here?
So let me be very clear about this, and I think your Bloomberg tracker will identify or will actually corroborate this. I think there were $49.5 billion worth of commitments made immediately after George Floyd, and we all felt that 8 minutes and some odd few seconds of cold-blooded murder didn't reflect the best of us, didn't reflect anything that we wanted to acknowledge was any part of us. And so we reacted. We reacted with relatable comments and commitments. If I look at your tracker, if I look at other analysis have gone on, I think we've spent a few $100 million of that $49.5 billion. And many corporations have been reluctant to give you the data to track what their commitments or the accountability of those commitments. So the question is did we have a moment or have we created a movement? I want to encourage us to have this as a movement and not just relatable, well-written, heartfelt communications out to the public and commitments that we've yet to satisfy. But if we're going to make a real difference, then we have to commit to it. And I look at just I look at how many people in financial services who look like me and Ryan who have profit and loss statements. I look across the asset management industry and I can point to maybe 5 people who are in leadership roles. It should not be the case. It is the case that Ryan Williams is a proxy for one of two things. If he does not do well, the response is, I told you so. When he does well, as he's doing, the response is he's the exception. And so we can't have the systemic inequities be addressed by exceptions. We have to have them be addressed by a commitment and a movement, which yet today has yet to come to fruition.
I also want to discuss a problem inside of the workplace. Ryan, you and I have talked about this before, and Ray, I believe you've told this to Ryan, and I've heard it separately. Marty Chavez had told this to me from Goldman Sachs, that when you're a minority, you have to work twice as hard, often to get half as much. I think the reason this is relevant right now is because we're in a place where we don't have Black people in America being employed at the same rates as white people in America. We also have high levels of employee burnout and turnover in this country right now. So, how can this issue start to be fixed? What steps can employers take to make sure that their workforce, their Black, their Latinx, and their female workforces and other minorities that they have are getting opportunities inside of their ranks?
I think you directed that to Ryan, and I think what he's doing at Cadre is an example of that others can emulate. So Ryan, why don't you kind of give us a sense of what you're accomplishing at Cadre?
Thank you. So there's a lot that can be done. I mean, I think the first point is we all have to have more compassion and understanding and recognize that, the events over the past year and a half were not just some spontaneous combustion of, frustration and anger and the like. There have been deep-seated, long-standing disparities and inequities that have finally reached, the collective consciousness. And what that means is that there are a lot of people who are outsiders, who continue to be outsiders, who have not been let in, to a lot of these closed-in networks. And, we need to do everything we can to creatively reach out to a lot of those folks and to reimagine some of the quote-unquote criteria. One of the points Ray brought up that just really resonates with me is the reality that for too many minorities and others who have been marginalized, you've got to be exceptional just to get sort of baseline opportunities. And that's completely true. It rings very true to me and what I've seen at Cadre. But I think it also highlights that, the way folks look at risk, and the risk ascribed to people who are different is completely broken. And, again, what we've done at Cadre beyond internships is rethought, promotion and who we promote. We've instituted employee resource groups focused on a number of different groups across the organization that have been marginalized, to give people a voice and a forum, and to let others who have not been marginalized listen, learn, and act. And I think, again, it starts with resourcing behind these conversations, but also action, and, sort of putting aside this whole preconceived notion of there being more risk because, somebody is not a white male, especially in industries like finance, real estate, and tech, and that they can't, step up and excel. And we've seen, frankly, the fact that we have people from all walks of life at our organization be a competitive advantage, allow us to find opportunities others will miss. And again, I think that will continue to be true, especially as society changes and becomes, more multi-racial, multidimensional, and more diverse. And so there's a business imperative as well for organizations to really rethink, the makeup of their workforce, who's being promoted, who's being heard, who's not, and then the burden that a lot of folks who are Black and brown have, especially in these times when the microscope's even more so on them as to their performance and the like.
Ray, I'm wondering how this has impacted you and your career, right? Obviously, you have banked many of the world's largest corporations throughout your career, as well as risen to the top ranks of one of the biggest banks in the world. That idea of working twice as hard is not the part that everybody sees. And so, how could things have been different?
I think I'm not convinced that they could have, other than this risk mindset. So let's stay with that. Financial services, in order to succeed, you got to manage risk. It's risk mitigation. And so you work harder, you over-credentialize so that when people look at your resume, which before they see the resume, you are a high-risk candidate. When they see how well you've performed, if they see the credentials, then they've mitigated their risk and they're prepared to make the investment, if you will. Or they're prepared, if not make an investment, they're prepared to take a chance. And so if you look at Ryan's background, if you look at my background, and look at others who have succeeded, many of them have succeeded against a risk profile that would have excluded them from the outset. We need to begin to think about how we manage that risk profile, the risk mitigation exercise that culturally we have gone through, which has resulted in the systemic inequities in healthcare, in education, in the economic system, in housing, in the criminal justice system. That risk mitigation mechanism that is cultural is yet to be addressed. And so it is the case still today that in order to be equal, you got to be better. And so in my world, in my 30 some odd years of Wall Street, that's always been the case.
It's interesting because when it comes to risk mitigation, Ryan, you've given me this really amazing story about how you were often denied a loan. And so can you explain that process to me, and what was it keeping you from getting access to the financial system as a borrower?
Yeah, so the story you're referencing is one that happened, I guess, more than 10 years ago now. I'd started a real estate business when I was an undergrad, buying single-family homes in Atlanta. I wanted to take that next step in my growth and buy apartment buildings as well. And I had some classmates and others who had backed me. I had great credit behind me. I had a track record. I was young, of course, but for my investors and the people that backed me, they said, "Look, getting a loan with your track record and with our backing should be a no-brainer." And I got connected to a couple of banks. First banks, gave me a bunch of different reasons why they wouldn't finance this property, all of which came down to risk and, me being a more risky borrower. And I said, all right, well, maybe just a couple of outliers there. 8 banks later, I was turned down by every single one, even after putting, people who were millionaires credit behind me. And the final bank, and I really made this his last-ditch effort, that gave me a shot, was a bank called Citizens Trust Bank, Black-owned bank in Atlanta, founded in 1921. Dr. Martin Luther King was an advisor. Coretta Scott King was on the board for a while. It was started by a few Black entrepreneurs, frankly, to serve communities that had been underserved, predominantly Black and brown communities. And they gave me a shot. They issued me the loan. We made a good return on the investment for our investors. And I don't think I would have been here, at least as quickly as I have, if I didn't have that institution take that shot and give me that opportunity. What we're trying to do with Cadre is level the playing field, is support other entrepreneurs, because again, I should not be the exception. I should not need to be exceptional to have baseline opportunities. And I think it's a lesson that others can also emulate: the power of institutions, and especially community-based institutions. And frankly, the fact that so many have been deprived of capital and resources, which ultimately hurts the underlying communities themselves and people who have been marginalized for a while.
Ray, it's interesting.
Let me just pick something they said. He should not be the exception. Let's stipulate that. But in order for him to be where he is, he has had to be exceptional. And so here's a student at Harvard who reaches out, who wants your probe to see how he's thinking about the world and himself. That reflects exceptional. This is, I'm dealing with genius here, and these are words that I choose very carefully. In order for him to be where he is in a majority world that shies away from risk, especially for people who look like Ryan, just think about that which he has had to overcome to be in a position where he could start and run successfully Cadre.
I know both of you have had a lot of conversations with a lot of corporate leaders over the last, maybe lifetime rather than year, right? Although the last year was certainly a very big one. What are things that you can share with folks today on tangible things that they should be doing and looking at, starting now, if they haven't been, that can start to move the needle? Ray, maybe you get us started here.
Listen, the thing that is educational system today is an abject, catastrophic failure. It should not be the case in this city that we spend $27,000 a year on educating a child, and in the Bronx, when the school year opens, that the parents have to come together and buy toilet paper and crayons. It should not be the case that 3rd through 8th grade Black and brown boys and girls, 8 out of 10 are below grade level in reading and math. It shouldn't be the case. So we first have to begin with the educational system and how we transform that. Modern day language, radically transition that from its abject failure to something that at least suggests some kind of success. We need to get capital in the communities. Remember, there is no social justice without economic justice. We have 11+% unemployment rate in New York City, writ large. In some of the boroughs, it's 20+%. So unless we get education and hope and training and capital in any of these communities, the future is going to be grim. And we have to begin to address that now. So I would say capital, workforce training, education, community centers to give our children some sense of hope. It can't be the case that you go into a school, which is what we've done over the past couple of days, and find firearms amongst 13 and 14-year-olds. There's no hope. We got to inject hope, which means we got to invest in the communities, put capital in those communities, in the community centers, identify the leaders, invest in those leaders.
Ryan, would you like to add?
I don't know if I can add much more to that, but I'll touch on the economic justice and the economic dimension to what Ray just highlighted, because as you mentioned, Sonali, there's been a lot of statements and a lot of declarations from institutions about their commitment to diversity and their focus on backing diverse managers, diverse allocators. And I'm very curious to see what the numbers actually show. I'm very immersed in that world, just given, we've raised institutional capital. And what I've seen is that there's still a lot more talk than action. People are not putting their money where their mouth is, people being allocators in institutions. And again, I know that I'm very fortunate to be in the position that I'm in right now, but there are a lot of people who are incredibly capable, real estate, private equity, managers that come from underrepresented backgrounds that are not getting the opportunity because of this whole risk dynamic. So if I were to give some feedback and advice to institutions and allocators of capital, what I would say is, diversify your manager base, put your money where your mouth is. And I guarantee you that, those managers that come from diverse backgrounds, had to go through a whole lot to even be in the position that they're in, to be talking to you right now. And, what better attribute for someone other than integrity is there than resilience and the ability to prosper in the face of adversity. So to me, I think that the accountability on the economic justice front can also be applied to a lot of the financial institutions that have aggregated capital, but still have a pretty homogeneous manager base and partner base. And hopefully, the past year and a half will illuminate these issues in a way that drives action. And as Ray had highlighted so well, it's not just a moment, but a true movement.
Closing thoughts here a little bit. It sounds like accountability, and that seems to be a big part, both from investors as well as anybody who allocates capital, as well as sits at the top of a business and taking chances on people. Sounds like a big part of this as well. But yes, we have a minute or so left. Any closing thoughts on top of that as well? I mean, this is definitely a discussion, obviously, that you'll hear from all day, but we will follow up with you as well.
Yeah, my closing thoughts are, look at the example of Ryan Williams and look at what that example is translated into when it comes to opportunity. Harvard, Goldman Sachs, Blackstone, as well trained and as well credentialized as any. Ryan should be an example of that which is possible through all the risks that people have taken. They've mitigated that risk based on his credentials and his performance. We need to make certain that we identify the other Ryan Williams of the world and use Cadre as an example of that which we can do if we're committed, and not just give lip service to it, but to make certain we actually put dollars behind it and put a little risk capital to work. You can see the returns are going to be incalculable, not only from a social justice standpoint, but importantly from a fiduciary standpoint, and the returns that get generated, which you got to be in the top decile, if not higher. That's what I would encourage us to do.
Do you have any closing thoughts as well?
Thank you, Ray. My closing thoughts are the importance of mentorship, and you still need a see to be able to believe. And I'll reciprocate what Ray had said. And I had a lot of dark times. When I was an undergrad, I went to public schools. I didn't really know, frankly, what I was doing my freshman year. And people like Ray, and Ray specifically, was a beacon of light for me and for my roommates who also came from similar backgrounds. And I think it can't be forgotten that, examples, leaders like Ray, who frankly had to navigate way more challenging circumstances than I did in the financial services space, and one of the earliest pioneers in terms of just exceptionalism, that example in highlighting more folks like Ray have a follow-on effect, and that there'll be so many more people who can see what can be done. And so this mentorship, I think companies need to think about formalizing mentorship policies, connecting to connectors, and again, creating a better future.